Dr. Saharah Moon Chapotin is the Executive Director of the United States Botanic Garden. She is a plant scientist with a passion for educating people about the importance of plants in agriculture. Prior to joining the USBG, Saharah Moon worked at the United States Agency for International Development, where she most recently was the Deputy Assistant to the Administrator at USAID's Bureau for Food Security. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Stanford University and a doctorate in plant physiology from Harvard University. Earlier in her career, she conducted forest ecology and canopy biology research throughout the United States, Madagascar, and Costa Rica. We're so glad to have her here with us today. Welcome, Saharah Moon. And with that, I will hand things over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us to learn more about one of our favorite beverages, coffee. My name is Saharah Moon Chapotin. I'm here at the U.S. Botanic Garden, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our series of plant science concert conversations. Last month, we featured two scientists speaking about crop wild relatives, and today we will be hearing from two distinguished scientists about conservation and genetic resources in coffee. I'm especially interested in the intersection of conservation and agriculture, and I believe Botanic Gardens and Arboretum really have an important role to play here. Gardens, there's a few areas, I'll just talk about them very briefly. Gardens have an important role to play in plant research, and we hire scientists and can bring relevant experts to the issues, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Krishnan, who of course works at a Botanic Garden. Botanic Gardens and Arboretum also maintain a lot of plant genetic diversity in both living and preserved collections. It's actually estimated that there are about 120,000 plants cultivated in gardens worldwide. And we also house extensive seed banks and herbaria. Our collections across Botanic Gardens are hugely important to ex situ conservation. So that's the preservation of plants outside of their natural environment. And many gardens also contribute to conservation efforts such as habitat restoration. And finally, gardens and arboretum are strong in education, and we can pivot these resources to focus on food and agriculture as we're doing today. So this is one of the reasons I'm so excited about today's talk. We're bringing together two scientists, one from a botanic garden and one from an agricultural research center, to talk about conservation and breeding in one of the world's most important and delicious crops. So now I am looking forward to, I'll introduce both of our speakers. Dr. Sarada Krishnan is Director of Horticulture and the Center for Global Initiatives at Denver Botanic Gardens. She is responsible for directing the design and maintenance of the horticulture displays and collections, and for developing and leading global projects. Sarada was involved in developing the global strategy for the conservation of coffee genetic resources in collaboration with the Global Crop Diversity Trust and World Coffee Research. She serves on the USDA National Genetic Resources Advisory Council and is the chair of USDA's Coffee and Cacao Crop Germplasm Committee. She's on the board of Women First International Fund, a nonprofit organization providing small grants for grassroots projects that empower women and girls in developing countries. She has published numerous papers and chapters on coffee genetic resources, botanic gardens, and sustainable agriculture in peer-reviewed journals and books. She has a Master of Science degree in horticulture from Colorado State University, and her doctorate research at the University of Colorado Boulder focused on the conservation genetics of wild coffee in Madagascar coffee species. Dr. Chifumi Nagai is the Senior Research Scientist for the Hawaii Agriculture Research Center and an affiliate graduate faculty of the University of Hawaii. She has over 30 years of research experience in genetics, plant breeding, and biotechnology of tropical plants, including sugarcane, coffee, and cacao. Her coffee research projects have included developing new coffee cultivars for unique cupping quality and disease resistance, molecular marker-assisted breeding, working in international teams with Japan and Madagascar to develop new coffee varieties with low caffeine, identifying chemicals in green coffee beans that determine coffee flavor quality, and establishing a new germplasm collection of coffee in collaboration with the USDA Pacific Basin Agricultural Research Center in Hilo, Hawaii. Dr. Nagai is a member of the USDA's Coffee and Cacao Germplasm Committee. She earned her Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in agricultural chemistry at Tsukuba University in Japan, and she earned her PhD from University of Hawaii in tropical plant and soil science. So I'm very much looking forward to both of their talks. But just a reminder, if you have questions, you can put those in the questions tab, and we're going to do one more poll right before we get into our first talk. So what is the daily global consumption of coffee? Can you guess? looking like we're getting a bit of a winner here. I'll let votes come in. More votes coming here. All right, so I'm seeing the majority of you have selected the right answer. 2.2 billion cups of coffee are drunk around the world every day. It's really an important crop. So we are going to go ahead with Dr. Krishnan's presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Saharah Moon. Thanks for inviting me and having me here today. And it is my pleasure. I always love talking about coffee, and it was so nice to see many of you are coffee drinkers, multiple coffee a day. Anyway, I am going to mainly talk about the conserving coffee genetic resources, and specifically, I'll talk a little bit about the mostly about the global coffee conservation strategy. So I'll give a brief introduction to coffee. Coffee belongs to the plant family Rubiaceae, and there are 124 species of coffee distributed in Africa, Madagascar, and other Indian Ocean islands, and in India, Southeast Asia, and there is one species in Australia. And of these 124 species, the two main cultivated species, there are only two cultivated species, Arabica coffee, the Coffea arabica, and Robusta coffee, which is Coffea canephora. And Arabica constitutes about 60% of the global coffee production, with Robusta about 40%. So most of the coffee you drink is Arabica coffee, unless you get Robusta coffee is mainly used in blends as well as in instant coffees. And coffee is such an economically important crop. It's a significant agricultural commodity. In 2020-21, the production is forecasted to be about 10.6 million tons of green beans. And it's produced in about 80 countries and with about 125 million people depending on coffee for their livelihood. And the economic importance as far as exports is concerned, it's about $17.87 billion US dollars. And as we said in the poll, 2.2 billion cups are consumed daily globally, whereas in the United States, it's about 400 million just in the US alone. And I will get a little bit into the global coffee conservation strategy. And so coffee, when you look at, almost every other day, you will see some news article about the threat of extinction of coffee or the climate change impacts on coffee and maybe loss of the crop. And so coffee has many sustainability problems. Climate change leads to more incidents of pests and diseases. And there is higher demand, volume demand for coffee, as well as quality demands. People are becoming more discerning about the quality of their cup, but coffee has a very narrow genetic base. And so to really understand, to really deal with all of these sustainability issues, we need to turn to the genetic resources of coffee. And World Coffee Research embarked into creating the global conservation strategy. And the main goal of the objectives of the strategy is to prevent the loss of coffee genetic resources and also enhance the use of these genetic resources. Because conserving them is really not enough. If we are not going to use them, we really need to ensure that these genetic resources are being used for furthering the enhancement of the crop. And the outcome would be improved resilience of the coffee supply chain, as well as the livelihoods of all the people who depend on coffee for their livelihoods. And Saharah Moon, I earlier mentioned about conservation. There are two types of conservation. In situ conservation is where the plants are conserved in their natural habitats. And through in situ conservation, you are letting the plants evolve in their natural habitats so that they can adapt to the climate as it changes. So Ethiopia is the center of origin of the Arabica coffee. So this is a coffee forest in Ethiopia. And then ex situ conservation is conserving coffee in what we call a field gene bank. One of the issues with coffee is it cannot be conserved as seeds. Typically, seeds can be put into cold storage for long-term conservation, but because coffee is a tropical crop and its coffee seed viability is only about 6 to 12 months, you cannot save them as seed. Hence, what we have to do is conserve coffee in field gene banks, and field gene banks are very similar to what we are in a botanic garden, where you plant them in the in a garden-like situation in rows. And along with the ex situ conservation, the challenges are they are exposed to pests and diseases, as well as other natural catastrophes that could happen. And so when we developed the coffee conservation strategy, we initially did a background study, which was a literature search. We did a survey and we did site visits, did a costing study, and based on that, we came up with key recommendations. So the survey was sent to about 31 gene banks. Most of the field gene banks are located in coffee producing countries, and most of them are owned by the ministries of agriculture in those countries. And of the 31 gene banks that we sent the survey to, we got 16 responses. And then we also did site visits to 7 major gene banks. The 7 gene banks, we went to Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ivory Coast, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Madagascar. And also we visited one of the in situ sites in Ethiopia, which is the Bonga Biosphere Reserve, where they work with the local community to conserve these coffee forests. And so what did we find? We found that most of the world's coffee collections are not securely conserved nor are they widely used. They're all nationally focused, using them for their own national breeding programs. And they also lack information system. There is no a single database so if somebody from Kenya wants to know what Colombia has, there is no single database system that people can access to look at other institutions to see what others have. And also there is very limited access to the genetic material. There is no sharing between the gene banks, as well as there is no safety duplication or the backup of collections. And funding is also insecure, and some regions have land tenure issues. And the horticultural practices are not standardized across, there is no standard operating procedures for across gene banks. So based on these findings, we came up with, we also did a costing study because we really need to understand how much does it take to maintain a coffee gene bank. And so these are all the major activities that a gene bank performs. And based on that, we use the Cartier collection in Costa Rica. That is the only international collection. So we did a costing study on Cartier's collection, and it costs about $250,000 a year to maintain those collections. So based on these findings, we came up with 6 high priority action items. We need to have secure fundings. We identified 4 origin gene banks, which is Ethiopia, of course, because of the Arabica coffee. And then Madagascar has its own unique diversity with about 59 species. And Ivory Coast, also the Western Africa, has unique germplasm in Western Africa, as well as the Cartier Gene Bank in Costa Rica, because that is the only international collection. So to fund these 4 collections, we would need $1 million a year. And for that, the Crop Trust is raising an endowment fund to ensure funding of these gene banks. And all these gene banks needs their facilities and capacities upgraded. And we need to come up with an access and benefit sharing platform for germplasm exchange for coffee, and need to have link the collections through a database for information sharing. And safety duplication is another priority, as well as in situ conservation. So this is my main thing, the global strategy. If any of you want to access it, the World Coffee Research as well as the Crop Trust website has them available. And so the next step is we are going to have, following the strategy, we need to come up with an implementation plan. And we are having a virtual workshop in July, bringing all the countries together. So that way we can update the global actions for the conservation, long-term conservation. And then we will also provide a report and an implementation plan and hopefully have an in-person meeting in 2022. So with that, that is my presentation, and I'm going to turn this back to, if any of you want to donate funding for the coffee conservation, the Crop Trust Endowment Fund, you are welcome to donate to this, to the Crop Trust. So with that, I will stop sharing.
Wonderful. Sarada, thank you so much. We are going to save questions until after Dr. Nagai's presentation, but you are welcome to start putting those in the question tabs if you would like to, if you don't want to forget them. But we're going to do one more poll before we move on. So remember, click over here on your poll tab, and you can see a question: which states and territories produce coffee commercially in the United States? And you can pick more than one if you'd like to. I'll give folks a minute or two here to get their votes in. The United States is a very geographically diverse place, so I see that several have selected more than one. That's correct. Votes are still coming in here. All right. You all have correctly ranked the top 3, which are the 3 places in the United States. There is Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and California, which are the 3 states and territories in the United States where coffee is produced. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Chifumi Nagai for your presentation. Thank you.
So let me start, and hello and aloha. So this now is, I'm going to switch the gear a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about how we can use these genetic resources to improve the coffee. Okay, next one. Yeah, we can go there. Okay, how I can, okay. So now it's a coffee. When you drink a coffee, lots of steps from flowering and all the way to get the fruit cherry. And then also we got to check all this taste. Okay, so now it's a coffee production. I just listed from seed to cup. If you are a farmer, you got to prepare your land, and then you got to plant the trees. This is very important. And then today's topic, what type of coffee tree you plant? The reason is that determines the final taste, major things. But not only tree itself, farmers got to use the water with control and pest control. And also after harvest, it's called cherry, fruit of the coffee, must process to different way and dry it. And finally, roasting coffee, then you can have a nice cup of coffee to consumer. So this is a whole process is involved for coffee production. Okay. So what kind of a coffee tree we would like to have for good coffee? So coffee got to be resistant to pest and disease, the area which is a problem, or you want to have a good, unique cup quality. And some people maybe don't want to have naturally low caffeine or no caffeine. Or like sometimes for big beans or small beans, that's another choice. And then also advantage for cultivation is environment for the coffee farmers are changing now. So some coffee you want to have a drought tolerance or mechanically harvesting. So all these traits we would like to have. But the lucky things is in old days, plant breeder like me to make a hybridization just from one tree to the other one and visually selected. That's a traditional tool. But now all kind of tools are available. For example, even telling the cupping quality to check. It's not like a good coffee, bitter. It's not like this. Standard method to testing quality is available, and also flavor chemistry. so many chemicals inside. And then also finally, now molecular technology, we can use this propagation method. And then also we know now DNA sequence goes, DNA, all that information in a coffee. And so this is a different tools available for breeders and the farmers. So, but still new varieties, we want to have high yielding, a superior quality, and disease and pest resistant, and of course is a cupping quality, and then also toward future more sustainable characteristics. So that is our wish list. Okay, here Arabica coffee. Sarada was talking about this Arabica and Canefora. Robusta is a two coffee commercially grown in the world. But the ancestor of this Arabica coffee back in Africa, around like maybe 600,000 scientists worked out 600,000 years ago in the two ancestral species of wild coffee made to the Arabica coffee. And still 4,000, who knows how many wild Arabica coffee available in Ethiopia. But we were only drinking two varieties out of this coffee, Typica and Bourbon. These are the two botanical varieties we were using for Arabica variety production. Okay. So what we do, if we don't do anything, coffee flower naturally self-pollinated. Its own pollen goes to the stigma. But breeders, before coffee flower, we got to remove all these anthers, source of the pollen, and bag it. And then next day, from other coffee, the flower, pollen, and then pollinate. And must wait around 6 months to have the new seed coming out. Okay, so this is just I write it down is what is actually genetic resources. It's different type of resources are used for coffee breeding. So for parents of the hybridization, and select some individual tree, some super tree in the wild to use it. And not only that, we can also study what kind of a gene or character inside of the different wild coffee. And then we try to use this one incorporating in the plant breeding. So this is the way we use the natural resources. Okay. So just I wanted to show you some example how we could use. This is within Arabica. This is my work in Hawaii. There's a one variety named Mamo. It's a Maragogipe. This is a big bean. However, not too much of the high quality. And then it's a mocha. This is a very tiny beans, but yield is only 1/3. So back in 1999, we crossed between these two coffee, and this is a hybrid look like. This is first generation. But from here, we must get the better one by selecting. And so our cases went to generation 5, and then we developed some of the different flavor, and then it's a very nice production, is working together with all the Hawaii Coffee Grower Association members and then the farmer Tommy Greenwell. So we developed a new variety, Mamo, which is a bit different from the other Kona coffee. So another example I want to say here is now Katia, the Sarada stock, the same Katia, this is the genetic resources. We obtained 10 accession, 10 different coffee from Katia. And then why we got this one is that in the Kona, there is a problem of the nematode. Nematode is eating up the roots of the coffee. Then we tested And then this is we inoculated or put the nematode in the roots of this plant. And this is a regular one, but all this imported Ethiopian type of Arabica has a resistance. So now this was a grafting this one with the regular coffee, and now being tested in the field. So this is another example. We could use the genetic resources in the plant breeding. And then you said you are all coffee drinker, and I'm sure you have heard the geisha variety in Panama. And this geisha, originally this is the Ethiopian mountain wild coffee, but it came to Katie in 1960s by United Nations mission. Then now the growers in Panama start growing. This is the high elevation, and now becoming highest value coffee in the world. And they were auctioning, and then they were selling all over the world. It's a very high valuable coffee, but originally came from Ethiopia wild coffee. Okay, this one more example, I got to be in a hurry a little bit, is the discovery of the coffee leaf rust resistance gene. And they found in 1950s natural cross between Canephora, which is resistant to coffee leaf rust, and Arabica in Timor. And then in the people in the Coffee Rust Institute made a crosses with working with a different coffee institute, and then developed all kind of this now new varieties. So all these new varieties yield is high, and also coffee leaf rust resistance, and then also cupping is good. So this is the new type of the new variety available for the coffee leaf rust. Okay, so after you get this seed, breeders find this new variety. How are you going to propagate? If you are going to be like a 5 generation, takes it almost like a 10 to 20 years, you can use as a seed propagation. But if you're in a hurry, little bit early generation, you want to capture the new ability or new character, now you can get from, if you like this tree, using a tissue culture, and then you can clone the tree, original one, to develop to this one, 10, 20,000 or whatever more numbers. And these things happening all over the world. So let me stop here, my talk, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagai. All right, I see that we have already some questions coming into the question tab here. Feel free to add your questions if you would like to. However, I'm going to start us off with a question that's been on my mind. Maybe it's just because I work at a botanic garden, but several people have sent me news reports about a new coffee species that I guess was rediscovered, the Stenophila coffee. And so I'm wondering if one of you could say a little bit about that and how it kind of relates to what we've been speaking about with conservation and new varieties.
Yeah, it's very exciting. I've had so many people email me about that finding too. I know Dr. Aaron Davis at Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, who has been the main author on this, I think 2019, 2020, they did an expedition in Sierra Leone and Ivory Coast and looking for this coffee, Coffea stenophila and Coffea affinis, and published a paper. And since then, they've been cultivating that at Kew. And at this point that they were able to harvest and do a taste study. And it is amazing that the stenophila tastes very similar to Arabica. And the great thing about stenophila is it is very adaptable to all sorts of climates, drought, as well as to wet areas. So it has very, very great genetic flexibility that using that to have a coffee that tastes like Arabica and a different species with climate change adaptations, it's actually phenomenal.
Great, thank you. Dr. Nagai, do you see being able to use something like a Stenophila coffee in future breeding programs?
It's very exciting. Okay, one thing, Arabica is only, we call tetraploid, like a 44 chromosome. And all the over 100 different wild coffee, everything has only 22 chromosome. So usually it's very difficult to cross the two different chromosome number individual. So using maybe chemical to double up the chromosome and to make a cross, or something, it's possible, like in Madagascar, they use this method and then, for example, recreating to the Arabica, using a different wild species. So that is exciting how we can use it, this one. And it's definitely very interesting.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and to follow up on that, the thing is, Arabica coffee was distributed around the world around 1700s. And then in Sri Lanka and India, the coffee leaf rust incidents happened, which wiped out the whole Sri Lankan crop. And that's when Robusta coffee, until the early 1900s, Robusta, they found out that Robusta can also be cultivated as coffee, and that was bringing an entirely new species for coffee production. So with the Stenophila, that offers a third coffee that can be produced, whether it's crossed or not. It's still, if it has the same quality as Arabica, it provides the opportunity to cultivate just the Stenophila as a crop.
Great. That's actually a great lead into the first question I'll take from the question tab. Robert says we talk mostly about conservation and genetics in coffee with a focus on Arabica, but what about Robusta coffee? He notes the market cap keeps increasing, but the research and exploration of genetic diversity lags behind to Arabica. And wants to know what can be done. How can we incentivize research into Robusta?
Yeah. Do you want to?
Sure.
Okay,
go ahead.
I can go ahead. Yes. It's a Robusta. It's in the market of coffee before. As I'm talking with the industry people, Arabica, different one is a very variable, different taste. But the use of the Robusta used to be only for filler or something for the introduce the bitterness. So it's not much effort has been done long time. But right now, to make a good espresso coffee is like within Robusta is actually variations much bigger than Arabica. So it's in the world, some industry and then individuals are working on is how to get what kind of bitterness. You don't want to have a bad bitterness, but a good bitterness. And so it's also, Robusta is so genetically wide, which Robusta you use to get the better taste, only the good one want to have, and then remove of the bad taste. So it's going, and I think it's like a more interest in Robusta coffee too, because Robusta is much more durable plants compared to Arabica. So, Sarada.
Now, and I think World Coffee Research, that is one of their priorities to improving the quality of the Robusta coffee. And I know that World Coffee Research is working on Robusta coffee, improving Robusta coffee too.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned some coffee companies. Philip wants to know, do international commercial companies involved in coffee sales donate towards your work, like Starbucks or Nescafe?
Yes, they do provide funding for all the different organizations, World Coffee Research, and also the Crop Trust also gets money from some of the coffee companies, yes.
And how about in Hawaii, Dr. Nagai, is your center funded through companies?
Yes, this funding. When I started coffee, this breeding program 20 years ago, is the Growers Association is actually put the money toward funding, and then State of Hawaii, and then also my organization, Hawaii Coffee, Hawaii Agricultural Research Center, we all share the cost and starting. But now that is one of the problem is a long time research. Sometimes funding is good, sometimes it's not in the 20 years. So some industry actually help to keep going this breeding program. So that is a lot of difference also for funding.
Great, thank you. Joan wants to know, in Oahu, the pineapple fields, she says, were converted to coffee in full sun, but in Kona, coffee is shade coffee. In Jamaica, it's also an understory crop. She'd like to know, are more pesticides used in coffee grown in full sun than in shade?
I would say the full sun is more to increase the productivity. And I don't think the disease, eventually for climate change adaptation, having shade would be beneficial for coffee to keep the temperatures low in the soil and for the plants itself. But I think over time in many countries, they have converted from shade grown to full sun, more for higher production, because higher photosynthesis means more production. But with that also comes the production where 1 year it's high production and then the next year it becomes low productivity. So that also happens, like you can see in Brazil. They call it, what do they call it? Alternate year cropping, alternate cropping. Where 1 year.
So it's cyclical.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Similar related question, Stephen wants to know, can you describe the ideal habitat you've observed coffea thriving in? Where would it grow best?
So the Arabica coffee of course, it's a tropical crop between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn and the equator, bit on either side of the equator. And as Arabica needs a little bit more higher altitude and the temperature is they 24 degrees Celsius is you don't want to go above 16 degrees to 24 degrees Celsius. And the Robusta coffee can take a little bit higher temperature and lower altitudes.
Okay, thanks.
So the higher the altitude, the higher better the taste quality of the coffee is too, for Arabica.
Dr. Nagai, one for you. Eva would like to know if you could say a bit more about genetic engineering methods applied in coffee research. In particular, she's learned about the CRISPR method through her coursework and is interesting to understand more about how it could be applied to coffee research.
Yes. For the CRISPR method, and then is the genetic engineering, need a lot of information of what gene is doing inside of coffee plants. And it's going, this research. But for the CRISPR, is a difference between CRISPR and genetic engineering, like GM approach. CRISPR can change if you know the gene itself. Okay, why this white coffee is, for example, just a drought tolerance to compare to this Arabica. So theoretically, you can change one or two base and then can modify the Arabica. It's theoretically. However, things are not that simple because many characters in coffee, for example, tasting product is over 1,000 different chemical inside of bean. So each one has a different genetic control. So it's this kind of research starting, I think it's an all different group, but still, first thing we got to know more about the coffee plant itself. Fortunately, already DNA information's there, but how different pieces do, for example, bigger bean or different traits. So still taking time. Coffee is not as simple as some of the annual crop like corn or rice. So it's going, but it's taking much more time to finish this, or toward more successful results. This is my opinion.
Thanks. Here's a question I think for you, Dr. Krishnan. Dawn is asking, how do you feel a botanic garden with conservatories in a colder climate could best assist with coffee conservation efforts? She says that they currently have 2 potted specimens, one coffee Arabica and one coffee Canephora, that bear moderate amounts of fruit each year.
Sure, I know coffee Arabica and Robusta are the ones that are mostly available in the trade. And a lot of the other species, other than in gene banks in the countries of origin, it is not available widely. But if it is available, I think it'll be nice for Botanic Gardens to become a backup collection for any of those species in our collections, but access to them is going to be the challenge because Robusta and Arabica, it's easily accessible. But a lot of the Madagascan species outside of Madagascar, nobody has them. So we won't be able to get access to the Madagascan species. So that is the challenge. I think all of us having Arabica and Robusta is great. And when we did the coffee strategy, we did through BGCI's plant search, did look at Botanic Gardens and what species they have. And there are 32 species in Botanic Gardens around the world that are in Botanic Gardens collections. So that could be if Botanic Gardens are able to share to other Botanic Gardens, it'll be great for all of us to have multiple species in our collections.
Great, thank you. And if I could add to that, I think a garden that may even have one of the more common species could certainly use that as an opportunity to educate their visitors about coffee conservation and use that as a springboard to start programs in conservation about what you've just been talking about, how coffee conservation is so critical to improving coffee worldwide.
Definitely, yeah.
A couple questions here. Someone asks, would you define cupping? And that was a question from Lynn. And then another related question here, Paul is saying, I understand that the quality for consumer also depends on the nature of roasting. How do you coordinate breeding and selection with this variable? So 2 questions there.
It's a final tasting of coffee is a consumer, like the personal food drink. It's different. Even like, it's like in the morning, I want to have a certain coffee. After a nice meal, I want to have different ones. So that is the very subjective opinion. Everything else, wine and chocolate, everybody has a different preference. But from coffee to, yes, from after coffee was harvested, depending on how to roast, before even roasting, how to process the bean, the traditional way is removing outside of pulp and soak in the water. It's called wash method. But then now more popular one is called natural. Look like a raisin, just put over and under the sun. So you can have a more fruit flavor goes inside of the coffee. Just itself, it's the 2 different methods, tremendous, exactly starting from one coffee, 2 different products. Then also roasting, depending on the light roast to really dark roast, you cannot tell that anything inside, like a large, this. So it's everything is in fact kind of involving for the final product of the taste. Okay, so that is my very simple answer. And then until maybe 20 years ago, all this cupping is there is no standard. And so there is no just, okay, this is great, this is bad, this is defect. It's a not objective method, but doesn't have a standard. And right now, it's for example, CQI is a coffee quality institute. It's Q grader system. This is not the everything, but the very well used this method is a point of this acidity or something body. Body means it's the mouthfulness, this is the taste really good or a thin taste or some defect or something. Oh, this is the note of the, different lemony or sweet. All these things are standardized and making a point. So usually the buyer of the coffee and then also even the auction and all these things, there is a standard to telling this one is using this protocol. This is considered to like 90 points is better than maybe 75. You can see it. But even some people like maybe 0.81 better than 90, just like a wine. But I'm really glad to have now standard method for the farmers and buyers and can standardize. But still, the good coffee or the one your favorite coffee it's your own. That's I think.
Thank you. Here's a question. I'm not sure who this is for. From Sophie. Either of you are welcome to answer it. what are the challenges in bringing these wild and hybrid coffee crops to the market, and how can those challenges be addressed?
So a lot of these wild crops are not cultivated, and some of them don't taste very good. And like a lot of the Madagascan species are caffeine-free coffee. And so, but a lot of these have not been evaluated for other characteristics like drought tolerance or pest or disease resistance. And that is why it is so important that we conserve them. And even though breeding is a challenge, but eventually with CRISPR and other molecular technologies, there may be faster ways for incorporating genes that confer resistance to a pest or disease into the Arabica or the Robusta coffee.
Thanks.
And then, can I
please,
just add
yes,
one more
please,
thing?
please.
Taking time from seed to the first harvest at least takes 2 years. So to selecting something good, and then also you don't want to tell from one tree, at least you need a certain number. Research, breeding, or not only breeding, development, taking time. If you are doing tomato, after how many days already you can taste or you can evaluate, but the coffee, it's very much this the length is the nature of the tree. So that is another factor.
Yeah, so a challenge that breeding in many tree crops shares. It just takes much longer for the generation time.
Exactly.
Yes, thank you. A couple more breeding questions here for those of us who love plant breeding. There's a question here from James about breeding for resistance to rust. He notes that it's based to the T. locus introgress for Robusta, but it seems like that gene is succumbing to new rust races. So what's the future of breeding for resistance to coffee rust?
Yeah. Well, coffee leaf rust, unfortunately, is a competition between the disease, different types of race, and then the gene. So for me, now scientists are working really hard to do what is the resistance, this molecular DNA piece associated with the resistance. So much faster is in that to select the resistance one, and then actual test, it's called bioassay, actual bioassay, and then molecular technique. And this is just we must do to using molecular technique to becoming faster. That is the way. It's a very difficult question. I would like to know the answer to, but I think that is the challenge of all the other crops too. But we hope we can integrate different pathologists, physiologists, and then molecular biologists and breeders and the industry together. That's the only way we can speed up and to get something we like.
Great, thank you. I want to ask you a conservation question, Dr. Krishnan. What are some of the biggest threats to conservation, and is there a way for consumers to sort of support coffee conservation through their purchasing choices?
Yeah, one of the biggest threats, I can give you an example of one of the species I was working in Madagascar. Madagascar has seen a lot of deforestation. And one of the coffee species that I was working in, Coffea vatawaviensis, based on herbarium samples, I knew that it was in a specific village that they had collected from in the 1970s. So when I went there in 2008, went to the village and asked the villagers for the coffee forest where I can go make collection, and the forest was completely gone. So that are some of the challenges that you have with in situ conservation and then in ex situ conservation, one of the gene banks in Madagascar was completely wiped out because of a cyclone. So those are some of the threats that conservation, like species can be lost. With regards to consumer, the Arabica and the biodiversity loss in another sense, you also, because somebody had asked an earlier question about shade-grown and sun-grown coffee, because a lot of the coffee that is grown are in locations that have been deforested. There used to be forested lands, and they have been rainforested, and then coffee is brought into cultivation in those lands. And by removing all the native trees of that region, you're losing the local biodiversity. So that's where like Rainforest Alliance and all of that, they provide an incentive for farmers to have those native trees as shade trees in their landscapes, which provides the bird-friendly coffee or whatever that you see in markets. So that way it attracts birds and other invertebrates, so you can maintain some sort of biodiversity in your coffee farm. So that's where consumers can look for some of those sustainability standards when they're purchasing coffee.
Great, thank you. We're getting just a few more minutes here, and I want to make sure I can pick up some of these questions. I don't think we'll get to all of them. A question here about coffee in California, wondering where it's commercially grown. They note it's an ornamental in Los Angeles, but either of you can say anything about that.
It's mainly in Santa Barbara. There is a company called Fringe Coffee, and they are the ones who've been promoting the coffee in California. And there is a cooperative of at least 70 or 80 farmers that are growing coffee in California. But California is still a challenging environment for coffee, but the farmers are prevailing. And so let's see where it goes.
Okay, and this is going to be our final question here. Is there any breeding, Don wants to know, with a focus on increasing heat tolerance or cold tolerance so that plants could be grown in more locations?
I am not familiar with that particularly for the heat or cold. And I know some work for drought tolerance. This is the work to try to find a gene in Brazil to find what is actually responsible to more water usage. But heat and cold, I'm going to look up, but I am not sure. Yes.
Okay, well then I'll get to
Brazil is doing
Please.
some frost tolerance. Brazil has one of their, the IAPAR, when we visited the gene bank in 2016, the IAPAR, one of their breeding goals is because Brazil always gets frost every once in a while, which wipes out their whole crop, and then they have to all replant. So one of the things that they're looking at is frost tolerance in Brazil.
Thank you. And I understand the World Coffee Research Foundation also has been looking at some frost tolerant varieties.
And I just wanted to add this one. Now, modern technology, for example, if we don't know the cold tolerance in coffee itself, but then like a tomato, whatever, other species, same kind of gene is responsible for certain mechanism in the plant physiology. So we can borrow, or we can really use knowledge from other crops. So then apply to coffee. So that is a new modern way, or now because the across the different plants, that is very exciting things are happening. Thank you.
That is exciting. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank you both so much for taking the time to share your expertise and your knowledge with us, and for such a stimulating and engaging conversation on coffee, conservation, and genetic resources. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.